After a short break, when we were contesting and winning the odd election, welcome back to SDP Talk. My guest today is a writer and columnist for The New Statesman who's written a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Louise Perry, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Now, I was thinking the best thing to do would be to try and define the sexual revolution. So I've written something down, my words, not yours, and see what you think. I've defined it as the replacement from the 1960s of a set of established conservative social mores around courtship, sex, personal behaviour and marriage with a more liberal set of ideas based on individual gratification and freedom. So you start off with marriage, monogamy and restraint, and you end up with anything goes, free love and hookup culture. Is that a sort of fair description?
I'd say so, yeah. Sometimes people use it more broadly to talk also about things like women entering the workforce, which I have a lot to say about that, but not in this book. This one is just about the sexual norms, as you say.
So that's a fair summary. So, and one of the basic cases that you make in the book, Louise, is that women have paid a higher price for this revolution. Could you go into that a little? Right.
So my argument is based on the existence of sexual asymmetry. So physical asymmetry primarily. Women are the ones who get pregnant. Women are smaller and weaker than men, which makes them more vulnerable to violence. Women are the ones who, the pill is the thing, right? In my argument that changes everything, the big technology shock. Women are the ones who suffer side effects of the pill, who have the responsibility of contraception in this new social context. And I think that women have a lot less to gain compared with men from a new culture of libertinism, because all the survey data and evidence that I accumulate in the book suggests that women enjoy it a lot less, as well as suffering all of the negative consequences. So my argument is that it's a bad deal for women, basically.
A bad, terrible deal for women. So, and actually you describe a lot of these things as sort of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Something like the pill, should give you control, should be a good thing, but actually it's a blessing and a curse, isn't it, on your way of thinking?
And some of the results have been really perverse. Who would have thought that the pill would result in a rise in single motherhood?
And abortion, is that right? Abortion increased because it's used, you argue that it's used as a sort of backup.
Yeah, I mean, I think abortion peaked in the 80s and has gone down a bit lately, only because of more reliable contraception like the coil and so on coming along. Although the pill remains the most popular form of birth control, despite it's actually not quite as reliable as people think.
Yeah, no, it's surprising when I read that actually. You sort of take it that it is, but when you think about the number of people that use it, and then the number of people that fall pregnant, and then I think there's a figure in there, 25% of pregnancies end up in abortion because of that. And it's a massive social change that, again, it's sort of unforeseen consequences of a technology change, yeah? Yeah,
because it's just effective enough to have destroyed the norms, but not quite effective enough to actually prevent unwanted pregnancy.
And the norms were changed by the pill. I mean, you could make an argument that the pill suited men more than women, didn't it? I mean, the ability of women to say, no, I'm not going to go along with that, changed, didn't it? I mean, in that way, it suited men more than women.
It altered women's bargaining power. While also, I mean, I don't want to neglect the positives. Women's lives used to be completely dominated by childbearing, and often it was like seriously physically punishing, even aside from all of the other social consequences. But also I don't think it was a coincidence that Hugh Hefner campaigned for the pill to be made available to unmarried women.
Yeah, sure.
It was obviously in his interests and the interests of other playboys like him.
Yeah. No, you make that, actually the chapter on Hefner's pretty gory actually, and it's very, very well made. So it changes everything, and that's not the only unintended consequence, isn't it? One of the biggest ones, I suppose, is another sort of liberalising, not a technology but a legal one, which is the Divorce Act, isn't it, in 69. Again, could you go into that for us?
Entirely well-intentioned. I went back and read Hansard, and the people who were in favour of the reforms were coming from the best possible place. I mean, they were looking around and seeing the fact that it was very hard to get divorced, and people often had to jump through some fairly absurd hoops in order to do so, and people were stuck in really miserable marriages, and they said, why not make it a bit easier? No one expected it to take off to the extent that it did.
You say, I mean, in book and in interviews, you say that a lot of this is actually experimental, isn't it? Because we don't know what will happen with these things. You just sort of try them out, and then the consequences come later, and we wouldn't really think of that. But yeah, I mean, that's a good example where something that was, I agree with you, if you read Hansard and you read your account of it, no one wanted people to stick in miserable or abusive marriages. You've got to have a legal means to get out of that. But then it becomes a social norm, and really now the number of children that are being brought up by both, birth parents is a minority, isn't it, in the UK and the States? So divorce has been part of that. It's sort of normalised it, and it's opened the window. That's
the thing, because this is all about I think the problem with the liberal analysis of this is that liberals use the individual as the unit of their analysis. And it's quite easy to find examples of individuals who are going to benefit from liberalised divorce laws, for instance, and that's fine. There clearly are always perfect cases, people who are really, really well suited to whatever reform you're proposing. The problem is that people are networked. I mean, particularly when we talk about sexual relationships, which are by their nature relational, you can't actually laser in on individuals and make exactly the precise change you want without affecting the whole network and the whole culture, and you end up in this feedback loop.
Yeah, but I think that's true of so much of liberalism in general, is the tendency, if you prioritise individual rights, it's all about me, and we forget about the I-we balance, and we forget about the consequences. I mean, one of the things that hasn't been thought through, I mean, you can't see into the future, but a lot of this hasn't been thought through at all. What are the consequences? And we sort of take it as read. One of the reasons the book is so good, I think, is that you tackle some of the consequences head on and actually address them. And I'm astonished how few people do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. So yeah, I mean, divorce obviously impacts on marriage, but marriage is sort of, fewer people are getting married now, aren't they, anyway? It's not just that they can't hold it together. The fewer people get married, and as an entity, as a sort of institution, marriage is under severe pressure. You make a case, you described as a feminist case for marriage. Could you just outline that for us, briefly?
So the feminist case for marriage really starts from the recognition that mothers and children are acutely vulnerable, particularly in infancy, and that it is astonishingly difficult to raise a child entirely on your own. I mean, many women find themselves in the situation of having to do it. It is just about possible with a very generous welfare state. It's never easy. I mean, we just had last week figures that I think 49% of single parent households are living in relative poverty. Differences in, for instance, home ownership between single parent families and married families are amazing. It is in every possible way you can imagine more difficult to be a single parent than not. There are clearly some circumstances in which that's the best option among terrible options, in cases of domestic violence or whatever. It was, I think everyone is agreed that no one should be stuck in those kind of marriages. Although actually there's more domestic violence among non-married couples than married couples nowadays, so that the relationship isn't that obvious. But
that's rarely said, actually, isn't it? I mean, it's rarely that some of these facts are in the data, but you don't really hear.
Yeah.
I think that's partly the reason why the institution's been undermined. There are lots of other reasons, but it's the actual facts about it aren't said. We don't hear about them enough.
And if you strip away all of the sort of big white wedding trappings of marriage, what it is in the end is a legal bond between two people and their children. I mean, I think that if you don't want to have children or you don't have children, marriage doesn't really serve an obvious function. It can be great on a personal level, but it's not as essential. I think, though, that when you understand it in relation to the physical vulnerability and social vulnerability of mothers and their children, that's when it makes sense to say that you should have a legal bond between parents of those children.
It makes perfect sense, and also it's the way that our species has evolved. I mean, we weren't always in. I mean, you could make a case that the nuclear family is quite a new thing in a way, which probably is. But in any case, man and woman and children, that is a sort of survival unit, isn't it? Historically, or in our evolutionary past, you can't. It's necessity, isn't it? It's built on necessity. And then when society changes, and when you perhaps don't need a bloke around, or people think you don't, it flies in the face of something which is also true, I think, which is that lads need dads, particularly. And the data says that. I mean, when I read that chapter, I mean, I love the structure of the book, because you're tackling things head on, and the reader knows where they are at each point. You make a case for marriage, but on all the data, on all the mountain of published data, fatherlessness is associated with higher incarceration, criminality, mental illness, violence, teen pregnancy, poor educational achievement, and, as you say, poverty. So, given the fact that that's the case, why do you think, just on a really broad scale, why do you think it's so difficult to make the case? Or do you think it is difficult? I think it is.
It's definitely difficult in some quarters, but then the irony of that is that actually the people who are the richer you are, the more likely you are to get married and stay married.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
In this country and elsewhere. Yeah. Marriage is a luxury good, and yet the people who are most eager generally to suppress any sort of the case I'm making for marriage do tend to come from that same social group who actually are getting married themselves. So there is a certain hypocrisy there.
Yeah, well, and going somewhere, probably sounded a bit harsh in that even. Yeah, no, it appalls me. I mean, I have to say it appalls me. I think you've just given us a sort of, we bang on in the SDP about double liberalism. It's in a good hearts sort of social and economic liberalism simultaneously hammering a society, and I don't think you can be a social conservative unless you're against that and argue against it. But you've given us another one. It's a triple liberalism, isn't it, now, with the sexual revolution? But I think it does irritate me. I think it's, I mean, just in terms of the people I observe, Louise, the people that I see and meet, the tendency for well-to-do liberals to proselytise a sort of progressive case and a liberal case on drugs, on social attitudes, or any of this stuff, they always do that, but they don't live that way. When you actually look at, you say, let's not listen to what any of these people say, let's just look at what they actually do. Hey presto, you find they're living in stable relationships, generally married relationships, bringing their kids up pretty much in a protective zone, and doing the conservative thing. So they're speaking liberal and acting conservative. It's common, isn't it, now?
Yeah, Rob Henderson calls these luxury beliefs.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, the idea that
how does he define it? Because he defines it, doesn't he?
So I think it's ideas that confer status on the elites, whereas the negative consequences are suffered by the poor. Yeah.
No, I think he's bang on about that. And we should call it out. And it is irritating. I mean, there's little snippets in your book. You mention the propagandists for a lot of the, I think you define it as liberal feminism, the propagandists for this stuff you'll find in any university department. But you make the point, and I didn't know this, it wouldn't have surprised me, that most of the academics that do so don't have kids.
Oh, overwhelmingly.
And is it any surprise that they just want the world to be a bit more like them? I mean,
it's the motherhood in general, and other forms of dependency too, dependency of the disabled or the elderly, or, we are all going to be dependent on others at various stages of it in our lives. It's just a fact of life. But the kind of, the liberal individualist analysis can't really deal with that, because the unit of analysis is the individual. And if you're thinking about a baby, say, I don't think you can really understand babies as individuals.
No.
Because they're completely dependent on at least one other adult to keep them alive. And similarly, the mothers aren't really individuals when they have little babies, because, my friend Mary Harrington, who writes for Unheard, she said the moment that her liberalism fell away was when she took her baby girl home for the first time and was woken in the night to her crying to be fed. And she thought, well, I suppose technically I am an individual and I could choose not to, you know, say, this is your problem, baby, protect my own bodily autonomy. But every atom in her body is screaming out to go and feed this baby, who is you know, physically connected with her.
It's a reality check. I mean, I mean, you mentioned technology in the book, but technology has sort of separated us from a lot of the realities. I mean, I love Mary's writing, and I remember a couple of years ago she was talking about, you know, I think she was making some biscuits with her daughter, and other pressures were coming in, you know, say she perhaps had a deadline to write on it, and she said, actually no, I'll give that flick because the biscuits matter too, and it's just a matter of priorities. I think the lie is that you're encouraged to think that you can have everything. There's no debt or there's no responsibility, because I think that's the big thing. The big weakness of liberalism is it promises all these rights and all these freedoms, but doesn't mention that to have a freedom implies responsibilities.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it sort of all falls apart. It's astonishing. One of the things that I think is a factor in all this is that human beings tend to do what other human beings are doing. So when these great big changes happen, these social changes of what we do, how we hook up, what is given to be acceptable, what isn't, it's like a sort of roller coaster. I think you get a sense in your book that you're saying that actually a lot of people have had to go along with a lot of things that they weren't really comfortable with, but because everyone was doing it, we felt we had or should do it. Do you think that's a fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we respond to incentive structures, right? And if something becomes normalised, I think this is particularly true for young people, and possibly also even more so for young women who do tend to be very groupish. And it's interestingly actually the propensity to groupthink, the best demographic correlate with it is age. Younger people are by far the most prone to groupthink. Yeah,
the pressure's high, isn't it, to fit in?
Yeah, and the status is so important, and being normal is so important, and so on. So I think the criticism I get sometimes of this analysis is that I'm sort of not giving people, in particular young women, enough credit for having autonomy and agency and making their own rational choices. I mean, there's clearly a balance here. We are both capable of making choices as individuals, and we're subject to pressures, some of which can be partially invisible. And I think that it's those pressures that haven't been given enough attention. And I don't think it's good enough just to say, well, people are making their own choices, yada yada, and not notice the patterns.
I totally agree. I think the pressure's massive, and I think actually the strength that you require to give a sort of common way of behaviour the flick, you've got to be a very strong individual to say, actually, I don't agree with that. But actually, funnily enough, if you take things in isolation, the scary thing, I think, is that groups will do all sorts of things that are wrong, and people go along with it. If they were doing that in isolation, if you were the only person doing that, you might think about it. I mean, it's not just sexual behaviour, but things like debt, the acceptance, for instance, of massive amounts of student debt. I mean, if you in the 70s, 80s, it began to change in the 80s, 60s and 70s, if someone said, well, you can go to university if you like, but you're going to have 70,000 quid worth of debt, and by the way, you'll be the only one that does, right? People would maybe think, I'm not sure I'll do that. That seems unfair, it seems not right, and I'm not going to be an outlier. Student debt is acceptable because everyone has it. And so the whole cohort goes through and says, well, we're all doing this, so it seems okay. And I get the picture in your book that's it's the same sort of thing. You've got to be, maybe we've got to find ways of people being themselves a little bit more and kicking out against it. Do you think that's?
So that's part of it. I think the other thing is also just having better norms.
Yes. Yeah.
Because the problem at the moment is that the problem we have at the moment is that what young women in particular have to do is they have to learn it for themselves experientially, because they're not, and what's really striking to me in the responses to the book is I tend to get the most pushback from young women and the most praise from older women.
Right.
And I think that's not a generational thing. I think that's like a life cycle thing.
Right. Because the old women have been through it.
Yeah, they've learnt it for themselves, and also they're seeing their daughters and so on. They've accumulated enough life experience to
know the score is.
And they've ended up agreeing with my thesis. And I think that we shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to have women sort of run the gauntlet of hookup culture and discover that it's horrible. It should be possible from the get-go for them to sort of know the truth of the world.
But do you think word? I mean, I sometimes get confused over the different blocks of generation, millennials. But there is a cohort, isn't there? A younger cohort who are slightly more, apparently anyway, slightly more socially conservative. And this may be a rebellious thing. It may be just we don't want to be like our sort of selfish boomer liberal parents or whatever, or younger boomers. But do you think that's happening? I mean, do you see that in the data? People.
Yeah, I mean, so apparently there is this turn to the right slightly from Gen Z.
It's not the right. I deny that. I always deny it. I don't think it is the right.
A turn towards the culturally, yes. The turn towards the post-liberal quadrant from younger people. Yeah. I think it's kind of both simultaneously. So I think what I've seen, partly just from looking at social media and speaking to people, is a sort of bifurcation among younger people. So there's more negativity about porn and hookup culture and all this stuff, born often by experience. I mean, this is the generation who had porn on their phones from childhood. They were exposed to it really young.
Totally ubiquitous,
combined with some of them being even more sex positive than millennials were. So I think it's both. But I definitely have seen signs, and everyone keeps telling me that there are signs of there being a backlash against some of this stuff.
I think it's very encouraging. I mean, I see signs. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the terms. We mentioned the terms right and left and things, because I a lot of our political project is to the left economically, considerably in some areas. And but people say, well, it's culturally traditional or whatever. People say that's the right. Well, it never was. I mean, it really never was. Post-war, Labour figures would have been in the same bracket as us. Really, it's just that the left, I think, became liberal, and that's its biggest problem.
It's one of the reasons why I'm sometimes described as conservative, and I resist it only because that word is normally associated with double liberalism, which is absolutely not what I am.
No, I know. Yes, it's to be genuinely conservative, to want to hold on to what you love, which is what the best essence of it is. It's completely incompatible with double liberalism. It's the whole point. And I wish more liberals understood that, but they don't. But there you go. One of the interesting things about your book is that you've changed your mind. And I'm always interested in people. When I was young, it wasn't just when I was in the SDP in the 80s, but I used to have a little European flag on the back of my car, and it was and then I think Peter Riddle reviewed a book by Peter Shaw in the Times called Separate Ways, and I read it. I read it as an EU file, and I thought, actually, there's quite something in this. And I read it again, and I changed my view and became increasingly EU skeptic, just on a democratic basis, really. And you've changed your mind, haven't you? Because I wanted to ask you, does that give you you're in a better place, aren't you, having done that, having believed some of this stuff, and then said, actually, it's just not true?
I think you sort of have to have gone on that journey in order to properly critique.
To understand it?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, one, I still have friends who believe in this ideology, which I now disagree with, which to some extent humanises it. I think it's easy to caricature your opponents if you've never had any personal interaction with them. And also I think I can just about remember back to how I used to view things. Even though it was quite a while ago now. But
actually your serious people will engage with you and talk with you. Probably the majority aren't, actually. The majority will try and demonise your view or characterise in an unfair way. But I think that's based on fear. I think that's because they're scared of losing the argument.
Yeah.
Because
yes.
Sorry.
So I've certainly been criticised by people who haven't read the book.
Yeah, it's not,
which I think is telling.
Yeah, I mean that's just you can't. And I think you should always, but actually almost probably particularly your opponents, you should view their opinion in good faith. I mean, they hold their opinions generally in good faith. Some people I think are mistaken. If you're having to take people down without actually engaging with the arguments, that's not the best idea. I mean, I think the strongest parts of the book are just your clinical assertion of fact. You know, that's why the book, I think, will just bloom. It'll end up being a massive book, I think. One of the facts that you mentioned, which is so obvious to anyone that pays any attention to the world, you think it shouldn't be need asserting, but you say men and women are different.
Yes.
Let's just look at that.
Yes, I mean, chapter 2.
Chapter 2, yeah, and the basics. And it's like I'm reading this, and of course, you know. But and actually, so what are the implications of accepting that?
I think that it means that the liberal feminist project of striving for equality, but what that means in practice has, I think, been to make women more like men in every possible way.
Yeah.
I think that project is always doomed to failure, because at some point you kind of hit the biological buffers, and you can't force people into sameness anymore. I think that there were components of that project which were good and needful. You know, it was ridiculous that women were not allowed to enter the medical profession, for instance. You know, so that this is 100 years or more now. But I think that you run into problems when you end up denying the existence of sexual asymmetry and trying to underplay both the physical differences and also the psychological differences.
And that women pay the greater price for that asymmetry, as you demonstrate.
Yes, that the women are in many ways the more vulnerable sex, and men the more powerful. But then I think, you know, it comes back to this responsibility thing. I think that there is a reluctance among liberal feminists to recognise that fact, because I think that they see it as profoundly depressing, the idea that there are these immovable differences, and that men will always be, you know, bigger, stronger, more aggressive, etc.
Yeah.
But then I think the argument I want to make is, look, those differences exist. We have to just accept them, and actually there are tools available to us to ameliorate the costs of sexual asymmetry, some of which are associated with traditionalism, and I think we should be using them rather than trying to pretend there's no problem.
Yeah, I certainly think there's been a tendency for success, in inverted commas, to be measured on a sort of male rule. Yeah. You know, so you're constantly saying, well, you know, possibly male traits, you know, some of the worst ones. Well, you're measuring success against them. Is that what you want? I mean, is that progress of any kind? I don't know. Well, it is progress, but it may not be very good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't think one sex is better or worse than the other. I think it would be bizarre to claim
they're different.
They're different, and we all have light and shade.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, you mentioned technology in the book a lot. I think one of the reasons that you might call it the modern denial of differences between the sexes. One of the reasons that that's sort of taken hold is that the domains have changed a little bit. I think it's much easier to see or have a view like that in a collegiate or an office environment where, I mean, what difference does it make? But it's much more difficult to make that case if you're working in a brewery. Yes,
or a farm.
Or a farm.
Or a factory.
Or a factory. It's much more difficult because the differences are obvious.
Yeah.
So, no, it's very interesting. Listen, I think you've written a fantastic book. That is the book, and I urge everyone to check it out. It's a very easy read and a good read. And I think you've argued for restraint and dignity and decency. And I think the fact that that's counter-cultural is a pity. But I thank you for doing it. I think it's a wonderful book. Thank you
so much.
Cheers.